Research Den brings UAFS researchers out of the lab and into conversation with curious community members like you. No jargon, no intimidation, just fascinating discoveries happening right here in Fort Smith, shared by the passionate researchers behind the work. Prepare to be surprised by what's being discovered in your own backyard. In this installment of Research Den, Dr. Matt McCoy, professor of history, asks the question, why did one of the most successful athletic conferences in college sports cease to exist? The Southwest Conference was a sports powerhouse until it wasn't. From 1970 to 1995, social and economical changes transformed college sports. This project digs into the toxic mix of recruiting scandals, the weird public-private school divide, and economic pressures that tore apart a conference, while other leagues managed to survive.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out. I am going to talk about specifically the end of the Southwest Conference, but as something of a case study for college sports in the modern era, especially as relates to television and college football, which is very important to this whole process. And I picked 1970 because 1970 is the first year all of the football programs in the SWC were integrated. In other words, they had a black player on scholarship on the varsity team. Right? So in 1969, you may know there's a famous game between Arkansas and Texas at the end of the year. It was in Fayetteville. Richard Nixon actually came to the game. They were both undefeated. Texas won 15-14. Both teams were still all white, the varsity teams. And so it's remembered as sort of the last gasp of segregation in college football. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but nonetheless, because there were some programs that took even longer to integrate. But that made 1970 a good place to start because it allowed me to bypass a big story that I would otherwise have to cover. Though there are a lot of holdover issues resulting from that legacy of segregation that is part of this process as well. Now, if you're not familiar, the Southwest Conference existed from 1915 to 1996. And the core members, the ones that most people think of when they think of the SWC, in the 70s and 80s are here on the screen. Arkansas, Baylor, Houston, Rice, SMU, Texas, Texas A&M, TCU, and Texas Tech. Of those 9, seven of them are basically charter members, joined at the beginning or very nearly the beginning. The exceptions would be Texas Tech, which joined the conference in 1956, and then Houston, which joined the conference in 1972, a pretty recent addition to the conference. And here you go, big happy family, except that it wasn't always a happy family, though they were pretty close together geographically, which for a long time was a big benefit for the conference because it meant, for one thing, built-in rivalries, all right, with schools that were pretty close together, right? People who lived in the same community with one another who had ties to different schools. It meant that it was easy to travel to away games, especially for parents and friends of players. It was also, though, in many ways, too cozy. Everybody knew everybody's business, which became a problem in the 1980s in particular. Now, in terms of success, and I apologize, it's a bit small if you can't see it, but just some of the national championships at the team level for the conference would include several in football, including Texas in 1963, 1969, as I mentioned, and again in 1970. But that was the last football national championship for an SWC school, which in and of itself is important. Arkansas in 1964, not all of the polls, but one of the polls. In baseball, Texas won the College World Series 4 times. In women's basketball, Texas in 1986, Texas Tech in 1993. In men's golf, there were several national championships, including several by Houston, which was a powerhouse in men's golf for many years, and they actually won 12 national championships even before they joined the conference in golf. And Arkansas won 14 national championships in cross country and track and field through 1991 when they ceased competing in the conference. I think it's 14, that's what I counted. So, now, we saw Dr. Cannon last month talk about going to Sri Lanka and Belize and doing research. We just saw Dr. Husarek talking about going to China, South Korea, places like that. They're not the only ones who get to go to exotic places to do research. I have spent about 2 weeks in lovely Lubbock, Texas, as part of this project, looking at the archives of the conference. This is where the paperwork that was saved ended up. Specifically, at the Southwest Collection on the campus of Texas Tech University. There are, the memorabilia that was left over by the conference is at the Texas Hall of Fame, Sports Hall of Fame in Waco. And I actually haven't gone down to look at that. I was interested in the paperwork. One of the issues with the primary research is that the conference saved very little material prior to about 1988. Just because the people who ran the conference were literally so cheap, they didn't want to pay to store it. So a lot of material got thrown away over the years. And that is according to one of the oral histories that I listened to out there at Texas Tech. There are a number of those as well. From about 1988 forward, there's somewhat more archival material available. New leadership in the conference made it a priority to hold on to material. Now, many people, when they think about the Southwest Conference, the first thing that comes to mind are the NCAA probations that hit so many programs during the 1980s. And in fact, only Rice and Arkansas avoided being put on probation during the 1980s. The significant violations included TCU football, Houston football, Texas A&M football, and the worst were at Southern Methodist, which actually is the alma mater of my grandfather. He went to Southern Methodist. After being put on probation multiple times in the 1980s, finally in 1987, the football team received what is referred to as the death penalty. In other words, the NCAA shut down the sport for a year, and the university elected to cancel the 1989 season as well. Or 1988 season, I should say. That should say 1988. And they returned in 1989. It worked so well that the NCAA hasn't imposed it again. Because the consensus has been that it ruined Southern Methodist for at least 30 years. And that although these crimes involved literally the governor of Texas, right? Bill Clements, who served as 2 terms as governor of Texas, including when this happened, was the ringleader of the boosters that were paying players at SMU. Even with that, it so hobbled the program that it seems the consensus is not to do it again, almost no matter what happens, but we'll see. And here's front page of the Dallas Morning News the morning after. As you can see, penalties are about right, most in area surveys say. I don't know if they only interviewed TCU fans. Yeah, I'm not sure what the sample was, but that was how bad it had gotten. And in the interest of time, I won't go into all of these, but this was the most organized and the longest running. There was a sort of a similar program at TCU that went on for several years, but was not as involved, and it was shut down and did not restart. It's the easiest way to think about it. This one went on and on and on, and they kept telling the NCAA, oh, we're stopping. and they didn't stop. They kept going and going and going. Now, another important issue in the 1980s, and frankly, I wasn't sure what all to put in here. There's so much that I could talk about, but I wanted to hit some of the high points that really exposed the pressure points within the conference, right? And those recruiting violations were one, and all of the issues that went along with them. But in 1984, the Supreme Court came down with a very important decision for college sports. It's referred to generally as NCAA versus Oklahoma. Beginning in 1951, the NCAA controlled television negotiations for all the members. The individual schools could not sell broadcast rights, live broadcast rights to football games. They had to negotiate through the NCAA. It was a condition of membership. Right? Tape delay, they could do whatever they wanted. But live games had to be negotiated through the NCAA, which strictly limited how many times individual programs could be on television in a given year, and tried to some extent to spread the money around to as many schools as possible, but in a pretty heavy-handed way. By the late 70s, the larger programs in the NCAA were becoming really upset with the amount of control the organization had and the way they exercised that control. In particular, the schools with successful football programs. And as I'll talk about here a little bit, in 1977, those institutions, about 60 of them, formed what was called the College Football Association, which was a lobbying group essentially for the schools with major programs. Now, remember, the NCAA included all of the membership. That's over 300 schools. And even after reforms that reorganized the NCAA into different divisions and even split Division I into two components at the time, Division 1A and Division 1AA. The names have changed over time. The football powers were still not very happy because they considered themselves, in many respects, to be subsidizing the rest of the organization. Under pressure, the NCAA added CBS and the cable station TBS in 1982 to the contract. Right? Prior to that, ABC had the exclusive rights to live college football. And so if you watched college football back in those years, you watched ABC. And there was one or maybe two games on a Saturday and a handful scattered on other days throughout the year, Labor Day, Thanksgiving, the like. But being on TV meant money for the schools. And it meant some money for the conferences, but specifically for the schools that appeared, because they got an appearance fee, a big chunk of which they kept, and the rest went to the conference to be distributed among the members. So they wanted to be on TV. And one extreme case was in 1981, where there was a game between Oklahoma and USC that everybody wanted to watch across the country. And most of the country got that game, except for part of North Carolina, which got, oh gosh, I can't remember who it was, Western Carolina against Appalachian State, or something like that, because ABC was fulfilling part of the contract that required some of the smaller schools to appear on television. And the people in that broadcast area had to watch that game. That's the sort of, those are the sort of stipulations that irritated some of the schools, right? So eventually, universities, including the University of Oklahoma, sued the NCAA in federal court, claiming, because the NCAA had made clear that they would levy punishments against teams that tried to negotiate outside the NCAA. Right? And the CFA was talking about doing this, and even actually solicited bids at one point. So it went to court, and the NCAA lost all the way down the line. Right? They lost in the district court, they lost in the appeals court, and in 1984 they lost in the Supreme Court. Right? So the court ruled in 1984 that the NCAA could not require members to surrender control of their media rights. And they could then negotiate however they wished. And they did that in July or August of 1984, right before the season was supposed to start. So all of a sudden the contract was thrown out, and everybody was scrambling to try to figure out what to do for 1984 and subsequently. As it turns out, the Pac-10 and the Big Ten each negotiated a deal themselves. Those schools were not members of the CFA. But the other major conferences, including the SWC, and the major independents, including Notre Dame, decided that they would bargain through the CFA. And so that remained the norm for a few years. But one unhappy member of our big happy family was the University of Arkansas, which, being the only non-Texas school, had long felt like an outsider and felt discriminated against, and in some ways they were. Right? For many years, the conference had a rule that referees who lived in Arkansas could not work Arkansas games, regardless of whether they had gone to the University of Arkansas or not. As you can imagine, that same rule did not apply in Texas. Where else would you find officials? I mean, the rule in Texas was, as long as you hadn't gone to that school or didn't have some tie to that school, you could officiate the game. But it was apparently assumed that in Arkansas everybody was a Hog fan. Right? They eventually changed that, but it's one example of how Arkansas felt rather put upon. Texas had its own complaints too, and in fact in 1970 Texas was talking about leaving the conference. And the golf team actually did for a couple of years and competed as an independent because they didn't like the way the SWC handled competitions. In 1978, for example, Frank Broyles, then athletic director, having retired as football coach in 1976, in 1978 he did explore joining the Big Eight. There was talk that my beloved Kansas State Wildcats might leave the Big Eight as the football team was in a shambles and on probation. That turned out not to happen. It never really got past the maybe we'll do this stage on Broyles' part, but it did send a message. And it's part of the reason why the SWC addressed some of Arkansas's long-standing complaints. But the dissatisfaction grew in the 1980s, right? The poor conference image due to all of the recruiting scandals, and Arkansas was not implicated in any of those. I should point out that Gary Anderson, who was a running back for Arkansas in the early 80s, as part of a lawsuit trying to get out of a contract with an agent, claimed he was functionally illiterate and could not read the contract. So that didn't reflect great on Arkansas, but you also have to consider the situation in which he made that claim. Terrible attendance for when Arkansas went on the road. And in those years, the gate at these road games was split 50-50. The home team would take a cut off the top, usually 20% for expenses, and then they would split the rest of the gate. But when Arkansas went to Rice and there were 8,000 people in the stands, they were losing money. And they were actively trying to buy games against Rice or TCU, schools that weren't drawing at all, to come to Fayetteville or Little Rock and play them there, which didn't happen, but it was a big complaint. Texas didn't have a problem like that so much. Neither did Texas A&M. Their fans were close to Houston to go to a game with Rice, and they would travel. But it was a bigger deal for Arkansas, and they were getting tired of it. And there was a serious lack of emphasis on sports other than football within the conference. and for Arkansas, which had a very good basketball team, excellent cross-country track and field program, and was trying to build a broad-based successful athletic program, the single-minded focus on football was hurting the development of that program both in terms of prestige and image and in terms of cash. There was a lot of concern over what the revenues would look like in the future from television deals, as well as conference stability, right? Because if the CFA didn't hang together, if people started defecting from the CFA, then it would be essentially every man for himself. And Frank Broyles was very concerned about that. Arkansas officially announced their decision to leave on August 1st, 1990, to join the Southeastern Conference, where they remain to this day. It was front page news, especially here in Arkansas, along with the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. Those coincided, which led the coach, the football coach at Baylor, Grant Taft, to make some comment about Arkansas being somewhat similar to Iraq in the aftermath of this. But that was the decision. Interestingly, Arkansas lost money initially on this venture. They financially would have been better off, at least for the first couple of years, staying in the Southwest Conference. But the stability and the opportunity for growth in the SEC was just too much for Broyles to pass up. And South Carolina had just joined the conference the year before. If he didn't take the opportunity when it presented himself, and he'd been working on this in secret for a couple of years, which he later admitted, if he didn't take the opportunity, someone else might, like Miami, which was an independent. And he might not get another chance. So he figured he needed to strike while the iron was hot. And he did. And frankly, most of the public opinion in Arkansas was quite happy about it. The people in Texas seemed to say, "Good riddance, you traitors." When the word was flying, the rumors were flying around, some sports writer said, if we really want to keep them, we should just have the SEC people have to fly into Fort Smith and then drive up 71 in the fog. And that ought to convince them that they don't want Arkansas. This was before the interstate. But with that, Arkansas left the conference and left it, right, Iraqi take capital of Kuwait, hogs whistling Dixie, right? Right there on the front page of the Gazette. So having left, with Arkansas left, or gone, that left the SWC as a single state conference. Now if you were going to only have one state, Texas was a pretty good state to have. It's a huge television market by itself, and especially with Dallas and Houston, two of the largest TV markets in the country, with very motivated sports fans, especially football. So people who wanted to watch college football. There were efforts at expansion, which I get into in my research. They did look at some schools to join the conference. They also looked at an alliance, some sort of an alliance, like scheduling alliance and interlocking competitions, especially with the Big Eight, being as it was right next door, and putting the SWC market and the Big Eight market together basically equaled the Southeastern Conference in terms of televisions. So that was a very viable possibility. But none of those ideas really became urgent. And this was a big problem in why the conference didn't last. They didn't do anything. They talked about it, but they didn't really push. And they didn't really start to push until 1993, when it became time to start worrying about the next TV contract, which was due to be negotiated in 1994. Near the end of 1993, the new network, Fox, won the rights to televise NFL games from CBS. And that left CBS with a gigantic hole in their schedule. So they struck a deal with the SEC in early 1994, as 5 years, worth about $85 to $100 million to the members. This is exactly what Frank Broyles thought would happen, and it did. Not just for football, but for all of the sports in the SEC. And they made the SEC central to CBS Sports. Gave it a real position of prestige, which it has not lost. Without the SEC, the College Football Association broke up. They just did not have any leverage with the SWC, Big 8, ACC, and WAC. There just wasn't enough there. And almost immediately, the Southwest Conference broke up because the members needed financial security. And the Big 8 now was a lot more interested in not a partnership, but a raid to shore up their own position. So in the aftermath, we got the Big 12, which still exists with more people and in a somewhat different format, but it's still there. And initially, it was the Big 8 schools plus Texas, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and Baylor. Baylor, apparently, because Ann Richards, the governor, was an alum. And she and a few other politicians said to the people at the public schools, if you don't take Baylor, you're not going. According to everyone, that's how Baylor got the invitation. When Arkansas left in 1990, and Broyles admitted this later, they had been planning with Texas and Texas A&M for all three to leave. But someone had to go first, and everyone in Texas knew politically it couldn't be Texas or Texas A&M. So the idea, and Broyles said as much, was for Arkansas to go first, and then Texas and Texas A&M could leave because they could say, well, the conference was no longer viable. It didn't work. And they started kicking around rumors that they might leave A&M to the SEC, Texas to either the Pac-12 or the Big Ten. The legislators in Texas told them, and I'm quoting here, if you want another dime, you will stay in the SWC. So it had to wait. But in this case, it was clear it could not survive. So the schools departed. Rice, SMU, and TCU went to the Western Athletic Conference, and after a pretty exhaustive search, Houston ended up in Conference USA, which also no longer exists and has morphed into other conferences, as has the WAC. Right? So, at the heart of this, if I go back to our membership page, the SWC was pretty unique for its time in that it had 5 public universities and 4 private universities. And for a long time, they touted that as a big advantage. They had a diversity within the membership. No other conference at the time had anything like that. But the 1970s and 1980s, especially the 70s, were really tough years for private institutions, especially the ones trying to maintain successful football programs. Right? Student growth at the public universities exploded beginning in the 1960s and just kept going up. A&M being a kind of unique example in that it went co-ed in the 1960s and went from 10,000 students to 40,000 students in the space of 15 years. That kind of alumni base and student support meant that these programs had a big advantage. And as tuition kept going up, especially at private schools, you're talking about scholarships. Right? So scholarships are not tuition waivers. Right? Someone pays that scholarship. It comes from somewhere, and typically it comes from donors. That cost of attendance comes from donors. And in many cases, this was 3 or even 4 times what it was at the public schools. It became extremely expensive. Helps explain why they began to fall behind. The easiest way to catch up was just to pay guys under the table, which it seems most everybody did. And the SWC was not alone in the 80s in all of this. but everybody else got the message quicker, frankly, and it really hurt the conference going forward. But quite frankly, everyone had a reason not to be happy. Everyone had a reason to look elsewhere. And that is something to keep in mind when we think about the framework of college sports going forward. We've seen it already with conferences like the Big East, which started as a basketball conference and brought in a bunch of football schools because they wanted the football revenue. They had a couple of schools that played football. And now it's gone back, they kept the name, and it's gone back to being basically what it was originally. And we've seen the WAC change. We've seen Conference USA go away, reconstitute itself. This will probably continue so long as there are reasons for institutions to think they can get a better deal somewhere else and to feel like some of these institutions in their conference are sponging off. So that is something to watch going forward. How long, Big Ten likes having Northwestern because of the academic reputation. If they don't win ball games, nobody wants to watch them on TV. Right? How long do you stick with them? Right? Vanderbilt finally has a football team. If they weren't winning games, they've been in the SEC forever, but how long? Wake Forest in the ACC. Right? These are questions and issues that will have to be watched going forward. As long as there's a chance for a better deal, people are going to be dissatisfied with what they have. And the question is, what is the purpose of the conference? Maximizing revenue or maximizing opportunities for competition? All right, well, thank you. That is my presentation.
Do you have any questions?
Not so much a question as one of the things that struck me was the NC2A versus Oklahoma, and ruling that no, you can control your own media and image. Seems like we've now come to a more localized level of that.
It's a logical
Where you now
option.
have, right, individual
Yeah.
players have the right for that.
Right.
And it's interesting to see that the schools that at one point would have supported their own right to negotiate
Yes.
their own media have now seen it become at a much more localized scale.
Right.
That
And as I say, it's a logical outgrowth. But in fact, one of the key complaints many observers had of the NCAA, even back in those years, was that it was a monopoly. I can't remember the word. It's not a monopoly, but they're the sole market for labor. So they are in effect a monopoly. But there's a specific word for it, which I don't remember. Monosopoly, I think. Athletes couldn't go anywhere else for all intents and purposes. And that's what most people thought would break first, as far as the NCAA's control was concerned. It didn't. It was this issue with the institutions.
You sort of started to talk about it a little bit at the end, but I was just curious sort of how you see it playing out in any case. Because normally when we see these realignments happen, it's because I'm leaving for better.
Yes.
We don't often see the kicking out because you don't carry your weight, at least not recently. Are there recent examples that I'm not remembering? I think at one point Temple was on the edge of being kicked out because they had, Veterans Stadium filled with
Yes.
5,000 people in it. But we've not seen that in a while, to my knowledge.
It may not be so much a kicking out as just a reconfiguration. Where some of the schools may decide they're better off.
So you'd imagine it's just sort of breaking off and creating a new conference rather than just.
That's probably more likely, although I am not going to completely discount that possibility. Of an institution being told, we no longer want you, because as you say, with the example of Temple, it's been threatened. And I think they've been threatened several times with that, particularly because of the
the ODC basically was the opposite, where everybody said all the teams that could leave did.
Yes.
And then they had to realign and join up the Big South.
Yeah. Yeah, I was at WC school as well.
Which I'm not so sure has been a great argument.
Well, some of this is motivated by panic. One of the reasons why the Big Eight was, well, obviously they wanted Texas, and Texas A&M. They wanted the whole market, especially those two fan bases. Tech and Baylor, they kind of had to take for political reasons. But one of the reasons they wanted those schools was Colorado wanted to go to the Pac-12 or Pac-10 in those years, and they eventually did, but they came back when the Pac-12 imploded. And Missouri was talking about going to the Big Ten. They eventually went to the SEC, but they were talking maybe they go to the Big Ten because the Big Ten was thinking, well, maybe we get the St. Louis market, maybe Kansas City as well. So to hold those schools in, getting the Texas market played a key role in maintaining the conference. As far as Nebraska going to the Big Ten, I guess Kansas City, I guess there's much plus or minus in Kansas City. Otherwise, that's not much of a TV market. But there's also faculty issues. That's why Colorado really wanted to go to the Pac-10, the faculty. And there's a reason they called it Berkeley East, called Old Berkeley East. They felt a kinship with those institutions. Eventually they went. So there are some other factors besides just the money. But now we've got the ACC with such traditional Atlantic Coast powers as Cal and Stanford and SMU. I mean, it was one thing to have Louisville in there. At least it's on the Ohio River, which sort of kind of gets close to the Atlantic Ocean. But when the Pac-12 imploded, everybody would find a life raft. Cal and Stanford, that was the life raft they found. My guess is it's probably temporary, but we'll see. We'll see. How long are the former Pac-12 schools in the Big Ten going to want to keep flying out for 11 a.m. kickoffs in Maryland, right? And already those programs, they're, Billy Higgins and I interviewed Dan Farragher, who was the interim chancellor at Arkansas when he left. And he said that they would euphemistically refer to the non-revenue sports as spring sports. So those, UCLA, USC, Oregon, Washington, already they're non-revenue sports. They compete as much as possible close to campus to try to minimize travel costs and just do the bare minimum as a conference member as far as those sports are concerned. So, it's cheaper to fly than it was in the 70s, but it's not free. All this adds up, but in the end, it all comes down to how much money can you make playing football. And as long as that is the most important factor, situations like this will arise.
What you just said created a follow-up question, because I've heard some conversation in Irish press about the possibility of creating like sort of a football-only structure that football breaks away from the conference. These are their football-only conferences. I mean, Missouri Valley has some of this, right? Missouri Valley.
There are,
conference and the basketball conference look nothing alike.
Exactly, yeah, and you'll see that.
And so when you see that nationwide, where we have like a Power Four football conference, you can compete regional, and then you keep for national, and then you go back to regional conferences.
Yeah, a year, I think it was a year or maybe 2 years ago, Chip Kelly, who was coaching at UCLA, said we should all just be independents in football. And go back to the conferences that make sense geographically for the other sports. And just make your own schedule for football. And another question that comes up is, you want to keep playing a really tough schedule? Wouldn't you like to have a game or two that's winnable in the conference schedule? Eventually, some teams may decide that's what they want. Especially with all the money available in the playoff now. You lose games, you don't get in the playoff, you don't get that money. It's not the share.
I have to wonder about, you've got all these smaller conferences that it's just the difference between an SEC and an OVC, Big South is so tremendous.
It's not even close.
Right.
Not even close. Basketball, a little different deal, because you only got 5 guys.
I mean, it's D1 in Maine.
Yeah, I mean, And many of those do compete at the championship, the FCS subdivision. But there are a number of schools that do compete at FBS, the whole subdivision, and you're like, what do you think? But that's what they're trying to see how long it continues. But again, we're going to get into the cost issue. Costs will keep, as long as there's more money, it will get spent. And you'll end up in the same situation that a lot of schools ended up in the 60s and 70s when costs were going up. They just simply couldn't afford it anymore. And what do you do with that? Do you drop? You drop all the way to D3 and get rid of the whole scholarship issue, right? At least athletic scholarship issue. Or you create a super D1 and a mid-level D1 and then FCS. Who knows how it shakes out? But as you can see, this is not a new problem. Right? It existed even before NCAA versus Oklahoma, and it continues.
This video was collected by Dr. Dan Maher and Dr. Matt McCoy and edited by Riley Beaker, Ray Gossick Ambassador Intern.
This video is a production of the Sound Collection Lab, located in the History, Social Sciences, Philosophy Department, originating from the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith. Programming in the History, Social Sciences, Philosophy Department's Sound Collection Lab is made possible in part by funding contributed for the Porter Legacy Initiative.